All right, showtime.
Webinar is now broadcasting to all attendees.
Oh, nice.
All right, welcome to all the folks who are just filtering in. We will start the main event here in just a minute. Thanks for joining us. Perfect. All right, good to see everybody joining. Got a lot of folks coming on board here. All right, for those who just joined, we're going to start in about a minute. I'm going to give some other folks a chance to join us. We'll throw out some polls. Okay. All right, Victor, let's kick this bad boy off. Let's get started. I'm going to share my screen, everybody. And perfect. Okay, well, everybody, thanks for attending today. And for those of you who are going to be watching the recording, thanks so much for participating at all and being willing to listen in on how we talk about the cookieless future. It's almost like the craziest thing to ever happen to advertising, and we're really excited to share this stage here. So I'm going to bring up the next slide here so you can learn a little bit about Victor. So Victor, who is my co-host for this event, he is the Director of Demand Generation at Tugboat Logic. Victor, tell us a little bit about why this is a passion topic for you, because you brought this up with us as like, hey, we should definitely be talking about this with the marketers in your guys' network. Why is this a hot topic right now?
Absolutely, man. So, first and foremost, I think everyone here has probably heard some sort of bit of news around cookieless, right? And one thing that I've realized just looking through all the just articles that have been published, right, and Search Engine Land and Ad Exchanger, right? There's really solid info, but right now there's a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt, right? A lot of FUD, and so
Yep.
For me as a marketer, I seriously hate a lot of hype and BS, and that's where I'm like, hey, you know what? Something that a lot of marketers really need to know is like the best way for us to like really tackle this sort of doom and gloom that's coming our way, right, come 2022, is really to just start preparing, right? And so that's where I think that's where the more we as marketers kind of like get ahead of this, right, especially like starting now when we have about I don't know, I'm like almost I'm not sure exactly when in 2022. Basically, we have about, let's say, year and a half, right, to prepare. At least we won't be caught by surprise, right? So that's really the goal of like, hey, let's just all try to like educate ourselves and really like erase all the panic and the fear.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's just jump into the agenda real quick. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about what it is. What is this kind of cookieless future? What is it that's happening? What does this mean for us in terms of marketing, advertising? And then we're going to break down 4 strategies that you guys can use that you can even start preparing today. These can be supplementary to your current marketing strategies or things that can eventually replace some of the things that you're leveraging cookies on today. Or moving into the future as we get closer to that 2022 deadline. And of course, we'll throw up some open time for questions. But I want to throw out a question first. So let me see if I can't get my polling up here, guys. And throw out a question. All right. My gosh. There's so much nuance to the Zoom webinar platform. Well, we will throw up some polls in a minute if we can get them up there. But let's just jump right into the content. So, Victor, talk to us about what is happening. And you've already mentioned the date of 2022. So break this down a little bit. Explain to us, what does it mean that the cookieless future is coming?
Yeah. So, I think we've all probably heard about Apple's iOS 14 rolling out, right? And so, for I'd say probably the past like 10 years or so, right? And I know it dates back further. If you look into kind of how different web browsers are thinking about privacy. I mean, we basically have this sort of I don't want to say confluence of like perfect storm events happening, but really you start seeing things like legislation, with CCPA, right, and GDPR, right, and then you see companies like Apple and Firefox, they're leveraging privacy as part of their marketing materials, right, and so and we always see data breaches happening left and right, and it's just one of those things where, given that backdrop, really, like the past, I'd argue maybe the past 5 years where it's become really acute and people are just like, oh my God, there's literally so much data out there, right, about on us, right? And this is where Google, along with this consortium, the W3C committee group of basically advertisers, kind of like different publishers, have sort of gotten together, right? And they've been discussing this for, I believe, the past 2 years or so, if not earlier, right? But basically, they've been trying to figure out, like, okay, given the fact that, like, there's this increasing emphasis on privacy, people are demanding it, right? Web browsers are increasingly offering it, right, as part of their services. What do we need to do to really, start shaping that future of advertising? Especially since Google, in of itself, announced that, hey, we're not gonna support any third-party cookies, right? We're just gonna not deal with it at all anymore. And so that's where that sort of cookieless apocalypse, or whatever sort of doomsday scenario you want to call it, has really shaken up a lot of marketers, especially within the advertising industry, right? Where it's like, oh my God, cookies have been that sort of bread and butter for us, right? That's how we've been able to, do personalization at scale, right? That's how we've been able to do retargeting, right? And really that's how we've been able to, really measure the ROI of everything, right? And now, long story short, we're, it seems like our ability to measure ROI is being taken away, right? With the, the elimination of third-party cookies.
Yeah, and that sounds sad and unfair, but when you think about it in the context of like privacy for every human individual, I think we all can understand that that's the way that the market is shifting. So it's just a thing we have to adapt to. So I'm glad we're talking about it today.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So in terms of what it means for marketers, obviously some of that, like the bread and butter, the things that we utilize all the time for, as you said, retargeting, for personalization at scale, we're going to be having to find other ways to do those same sorts of targeting activities and leveraging our advertising in a smart way. So we're going to break down some of those today. But let's talk about some of those strategies, right? So we've already shared in a blog post previously, but a lot of folks haven't caught this yet, that there are quite a few strategies you can do that go beyond the cookie, right? This is not the end of the world for us. This doesn't mean like, oh my gosh, all of a sudden we can no longer do smart advertising. We can no longer think strategically about marketing. We just have to do blanketed spray and pray approaches. We can be very smart with it still. So let's talk about the first thing we can do to prepare for this cookieless future is obviously start to think, talk, and act regarding privacy, security, compliance. But like, what does that mean? Talk me through just privacy 101. What's the very like foundational stuff that we need to master here?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and to give, kind of like a further context for everyone, right? So, really like, given that it seems really bleak and everything, I know there are kind of like two main ways that different companies and different advertisers have been looking at around, like, okay, how, with the absence of cookies, what else can we do, right? Especially that respects, people's privacy and security concerns, right? And so really, like, two ways, the first way is opt-in cohorts, right? And this is where I'm going to revisit that real quick as part of that privacy, like emphasis on privacy, right? And so basically, like, you've already kind of seen it, right, with a lot of the media, news media publication companies, right? So New York Times, for example, they've already been experimenting with this, where they famously ditched a good chunk of their display advertising revenue, right? And then they realized that was a poor experience for their audience, so they basically beefed up their subscription side of things and said, okay, we want to serve people really good stuff. We want to keep our audience that appreciates the content we're producing, right? So the way they've experimented around is like, okay, how about we get people to opt into things, right? Really stay logged in to consuming their content, right? And so that's really where it comes down to, like, they're able to gather that first party data, right? The second way is around unique device ID, right? And that's kind of similar to the way the mobile advertising industry has been tracking, anonymized user behavior, right? And especially from smartphone IDs, and trying to show people ads based on what they've consumed through their device, right? But the tricky part with the unique device ID is the fact that identifying and reporting on those things are becoming increasingly difficult, right? Like for example, Apple recently announced that, they're cutting off access to this in 2021, right? So, for some sort of like cookieless workaround, like this might be kind of a tricky thing for everybody, right? And may not be a viable, way forward. So, coming back to the what I mentioned earlier about opting in and really like keeping privacy at its core. So for a lot of users now, they've sorry, I shouldn't say users, our customers, right? Our audience really, they've become much more educated, right? Around how, cookies are tracking them across different websites, how they're being retargeted. And so for a lot of our customers, some of them are like, okay, cool, that's fine, just the way it is, right? Others are much more like, oh God, like this is terrifying. And so given our users' concerns, right? One thing that we as marketers should really do is start thinking about like, okay, how do we respect people's desire, right, to have their web browsing, their internet browsing, any sort of like digital interaction, like be kept. I don't want to say private, but really like trying to respect their desire, right, to use whatever they want to browse anonymously, all that stuff, right? And so that the first takeaway there is like like try to err on the side of privacy as much as possible. And what does that mean? Really is like, hey, if we're too aggressive with too much advertising or too much retargeting, that kind of presents a bad brand experience, right? And so all it takes is one bad interaction, and people have that bad taste in their mouth. Now, more specifically, if we were to drill down further, right, into like, what does privacy mean? How do we respect that for customers? How do we keep that at the forefront, of our marketing efforts? One thing we can do is really be explicit to our audience and to our customers, saying like, hey, this is what we're doing to not only protect your information, but really like safeguarding that information, right? So you opting in to download this ebook or you making this purchase, this is really where, as a company, not just like us as marketers, but really as a company, we've really taken these like, really stringent safeguards and put them into place to make sure like, hey, no sort of data breach will happen, right? And not to say like none of that will happen per se, given that, there's always risk. But given that, it's like, hey, we have to try and reassure people as much as possible. Like, look, we get it. People are sick and tired of kind of the ads we're running. But at the same time, here's what we're doing to try to still give you that great experience while still being respectful of what sorts of behaviors and really your consumption interactions that we're tracking. And then the last thing really is looking at like, okay, what the data we're collecting from our customers, right? What do we really need from them in order to like complete a business transaction, right? So like, it's great that we live in the era of big data. We literally have so many things that we know about our audience, and it's kind of crazy how much data we're swimming in, and really trying to create that hyper personalized, that really, really great marketing experience for our audience. But at the same time too, it's like, we kind of have to go back to the basics around like, okay, that's great. We know about their name, their address, et cetera. But like, what else, could we sort of pare down, right? That we really don't need to inform, like what we're trying to, better serve them with, right? So that being said, I'll kind of pause there because don't want to talk everyone's ear off.
No, this is great. I mean, so what this makes me think of immediately for our own marketing efforts, let's say here at OpenSense, and for companies that I talk to all the time, like we have to be more proactive in addressing issues of obviously privacy, security, compliance with regulations that are happening all the time. So like when GDPR hit, there's a big shift in what we had to say and do in order to be compliant with that. But I like the idea of what you kind of explained there is like, we also have to tell the customer, we have to tell, prospective customers even like, here's how we handle these things so that they feel comfortable that they're going to have a good experience. And also that we're going to be respectful of their wishes, that we're going to use data in a certain way. And I love the idea of paring down how much data we need to acquire from an end user or a customer or a prospect, and just not do more than we have to for that business transaction. Because then let's say that heaven forbid there is a breach, you don't put that much data at risk. You have been a little bit more stringent with what you required, a little more focused, and there's just less at risk for them, which I think is a good experience all around. So I love the idea of like, look, we got to be proactive. We have to have the conversations about this. And considering that 2022 is that deadline that we're talking about, like now is the time. We don't want to wait till, fourth quarter of 2021 to say like, Oh, hey, Susan, what are we going to do about privacy? Like, is this a thing we should be thinking about? Like, no, we should be talking about this right stinking now. We should be sharing as we're making these updates, share with our audience, make sure that this is included. A lot of our customers, for example, use disclaimers at the bottom of their email signatures that explain like GDPR compliance or how someone opted in. And then we can get actually personalized down to the individual recipient level. So it's a really unique way of thinking about privacy and communicating that proactively to the person who is actually interacting with your brand. I think it's a really good point. So
Absolutely.
let's carry on then. So there is obviously we just mentioned this idea of CRM data, right?
Yep.
There is data that we are storing, collecting, like, and obviously our graphic here is emphasizing the deletion of data. But talk us through like what data do we need to keep? What data do we need to purge? And why would that even be a thing that we would consider? Like, isn't more data always better? I guess is probably the first question most marketers would ask.
Yeah. And that's really a good question, Rex. And this is something I personally grapple with. Like, hey, I love seeing all this customer data, right? Because it gives me so much leverage around like, okay, how do I, plan out different retargeting campaigns? How do I plan out different re-engagement emails, right? How do I, basically better segment, the people I serve, really into like, things that are more tailored to them, right? But the one sort of challenge, like, looking within our CRMs, right? Not to say like, hey, everyone's CRM is beautiful. Like, for example, Tugboat, like it's a work in progress for us, right? We're still going through a lot of data cleansing exercises. We're trying to figure it out. Like, okay, how do we make sure that, we ourselves are, really keeping people in here like that really want to be in here, right? And so
Yeah.
one thing that, in terms of like looking at like what kinds of sort of data parameters, right, that would help us, really keep that sort of first party data. And so I'd like to clarify real quick too, like, you may have heard me say like, oh, first party data or third party data. And really in this aspect with your CRM, right, really like given that, assuming, we didn't buy any lists or anything, or get a lot of people who, put into our database who did not opt in the first place.
Right.
Assuming we've done all the right things with inbound marketing, all that, we've gotten people from events and they all consented to it. Really that becomes that sort of, I don't want to say gold mine, but really like we really need to take a much closer look at our CRM and kind of like looking at all the data with like, okay, we don't want to lose any of this. But if we need to like, clean out some of it, or not to say purge it, this is how we can do so in a way where it's like, okay, we're not sacrificing too much, right? So one of the things that I'd recommend looking at is like, okay, given the amount of first party data we're sitting on that we technically, I don't want to say own because it kind of comes across as weird, but really like that we've, gotten permission to interact with customers with, looking at, for example, IP address, right? Especially as people start to, download browsers that already do cookie blocking, right? Or looking at, for example, more of the behavioral or demographic side of things, right? Based around kind of like the audience profiles we have from our CRM. One other thing too is and again, like not to preach like marketing 101 stuff, but really like cutting down and segmenting like, okay, these are the people who have been really engaged with us, right? Historically, these are the people who could, they come around every few months or so, right? And then looking specifically at the people like, oh, these look like really old contacts, right? Either leads, prospects, people just haven't interacted with us for over a year. And so rule of thumb I always do, at any company I've been at with regards to CRM data is like, okay, let's at least give them a chance to say, hey, do you still want to stay opted in, right? And really figuring out ways to re-engage them, and then really making it explicitly clear in an email saying like, hey, if you want to unsubscribe, that's totally fine. Like we're we at least want to respect that, and at least that makes it a much cleaner way for them for the audience to say like, hey, yeah, no, I no longer find your guys' stuff cool or relevant. It's like, okay, cool, no harm, no foul, right?
And I think we might even have an example here. So let me just see if I can't get that. Yeah, here we go. So that idea of giving it a second life, right? Like it's almost, how do we best use the current data, but like, how do we give this last shot, this final push? How do we make that look? Do you mind sharing this example a little bit more specifically? Because this is one that I think was very your style and probably very in line with like your brand strategy. But like, what does this do for the person who's receiving this?
Yeah. So the context here is, we since we are a automated security and compliance startup, we basically help people automate like sort of like the process towards getting ready for SOC 2, for example, or an ISO 27001, stuff that's like historically painful.
Yeah.
So for us, one of the sort of, I guess, cheeky giveaways that we came up with was around SOC 2 socks, right? And so,
Nice.
trying to be punny and surprisingly, people loved it. I was like, oh God, this could have gotten me fired, but hey, I'm glad it worked. But this is a campaign that we've been running for well over a year now. But one thing I noticed that a lot of people, sign up for it, right, through LinkedIn or Google or what have you, right? They interact with the emails and stuff, but they never really take that extra step, right? And so after some time, they get thrown into nurture, and they really don't do much afterward, right? It's like, hey, like cool, like that's just the way it is, right? And so with this specific email example that I wrote, really is designed to like try to get people to take that next step, right? It's like, hey, just reminding them real quick, like you signed up for socks, it's all good. Like, if you don't remember us, like it's okay. You could totally reply to me and say, hey, I don't know you, please unsubscribe. It's like, yeah, totally happy to do so. But for those who are like, oh yes, I still want my SOC 2 socks. It's like, okay, at least I can continue moving them, down the funnel. Right. And at the same time, aligning like with my goals of like, okay, want to fill up the pipeline, by virtue of being a B2B marketer, but, respecting people, especially like leads and prospects are like, yeah, I don't care for those anymore. It's like, okay, cool. Here's a very direct call to action at the bottom. Like, hey, if you don't want anything, you don't want to deal with us, you don't want to hear from us, and just click unsubscribe, and making it that very easy out. Right. And I will say, the number of people who unsubscribed was actually lower than I expected. I was like, oh, okay, cool. And it actually did get quite a few people to respond like, oh yeah, I totally forgot about these socks, right? So in a very easy, sort of casual, friendly way where it's like, hey man, happy to give you socks, just do a demo of Tugboat, right?
Yeah.
And then really for those who did click unsubscribe, it definitely spared our CRM from getting crazy spam reports, right? Because I've seen it before, not like Tugboat, but like where people get angry. They're like, I don't know who you are. You probably bought my name from some list. Screw you,
Sure.
right? They hit spam and then boom, we get dinged, right, on the sender score.
Blacklisted. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I want to call out that I love here, like obviously there's a tone and style that might not fit for all brands, but I think that clearly stands out. So first of all, it's kind of this personal email in terms like it's coming from Victor. It's not necessarily coming from the whole brand, but like, hey, this is why we reached out to you initially. And it's like even just saying, what's up, John? Like just changing the tone a little bit to stand out from your average marketing email might get a little bit of like, oh, okay, this is unusual. I better address this. And I also really love at the very bottom the idea of saying like, hey, if you're not interested, like it's okay to unsubscribe. In fact, I'm kind of encouraging you to do this. This is not me trying to squeeze blood out of a stone. I'm trying to say like, hey, if you're not interested, we don't want to bug you. We don't want to be giving you this negative experience. So like, please feel free to update those subscription preferences, which I think is just a really great strategy to just be proactive and just say, frankly, like we don't want to bug you. Like we want to provide value to your life. And if we can't, hey, that's totally fine. Like, let's just part ways as friends, which I think is a really good approach there. So awesome, man. I think this is a really great example of how to re-engage those old contacts. I like that we call it kind of the wake the dead emails. So let's just talk tactically real quick. If someone does not reply, does not unsubscribe, and just continues with no engagement, how long do you typically wait before either archiving or deleting their data from the system?
That's a really good question. So I give them about 2 weeks, right? And this is based on like what I've seen historically from our users, who people just sometimes take a while to get to emails, right? And basically after 2 weeks, then I basically slate them into kind of an unsubscribe list, right?
Sure.
For example, we use HubSpot at Tugboat, and so basically I re-upload them as like, okay, this is people who wanted to opt out, right? Because for us, especially given that we are a security company, I'd rather err on the side of caution on like, hey, if they're not really going to interact with us, like it's all good, man. Like yeah, like a little bit of me cries inside when I have to opt out a bunch of people, but I'd rather people be opted out, especially if they've been not to say dead, but they haven't interacted with us, right? Because that just only hurts my sender score at the end of the day, and really not trying to create a negative experience for people, right? And in the off chance that they do come back, it's like, hey, we'd love to have you come back, right?
Sure.
But yeah, so that's what I do.
Good. I think that's a useful strategy and a good breakdown of that. So I appreciate that. One that I'm particularly passionate about, because I've only been at OpenSense for 4 months, but that I've seen is just a ridiculous win. So when you have that first party data, right? When you know that you have data in your CRM and you're sending emails, there's a real statistic out there that for every 100 employees, you're sending 1 million emails. These are one-to-one. So like what you just described was a marketing email, but what I'm talking about is like emails that go out from the sales team, the customer support team, any individual person within an org that's sending customer facing or prospect facing emails just in regular interactions, right? So like here, for example, is an email with Lauren from Outreach, which is one of our customers, and like just this everyday communication. You can see this incredible banner ad down here. So the reason we call them email ad campaigns is because it's literally just another channel. But what's unique about the targeting for this, and there are other companies that do this as well, what's unique about the targeting is that you're already in conversation with these people. So we're talking about millions of impressions with people who are already either customers, current prospects, people who are interested. So when we talk about the engagement rate, it's so much higher. It's like it's 5 to 15 times higher than retargeting. So when we're talking about a strategy that could easily, supplement or replace what you're doing with your cooking, it's also 50 to 150 times higher than display ads. So the level of engagement, I mean, it really starts so high because these are people who already know your brand. They're already in some sort of engagement with you. And you're able to retarget them with this additional layer of value beneath the email signature, which is super exciting. So this is one of the things that we've seen win time and time again as another channel. And frankly, you own it. I think my favorite thing about this channel for targeting in general is like, you're not first trying to find the person and deliver an ad and hope that they don't click on the competitor and they come to you. It's literally the only ad in the email is your ad. That's the beautiful thing about these ad campaigns is you can run them in a very like competitor-free environment where they're already thinking about you. But the current value you get out of an email one-to-one is a reply. That's the only value you can get. And now we're adding that additional layer of value that you can get from them clicking and engaging with your content in addition to whatever they're doing in that direct email. So this is one that we see huge returns on for all of our customers and for ourselves. We love using it. Hopefully some of you who are attending the webinar today or who are watching the recording were able to see that banner from some of our folks as well. You would have seen it for this particular event. We ran a banner ad campaign for ourselves and it went very well. So that's one of the things that we see is easily able to replace or augment current cookie-based advertising techniques because you've already got that incredible audience and now you just don't have any competition.
Yeah. And Rex, I absolutely don't fit your guys' ICP, but, as if I had the budget and everything, like one thing, this is something I would totally test out. Just one of those things where it's like, damn, like, to your point, like really there's no competition. If people are looking at things from, customer success team or sales team, right? It's like, hey, that's going to catch people's eyes, right? People, naturally want to look at, what people's email signatures say, right? So I think this is one of those like really smart things where, like it's just right now, I think, especially given that, like, I know you guys got some really great customers like Salesforce and Adobe, like, some really innovative thought leaders there who have already invested in this kind of thing, right? And I feel like, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, because like, I obviously not a customer. I don't know the full insights there, but I feel like right now it's still kind of greenfield, right? Would you say, or kind of like an untapped, in that sense?
Yeah, I mean, for those of you who are watching or attending today, you may have seen an email ad campaign or something similar. And the most similar thing is when you have just like a little image that you put beneath your signature. That's not like a traditional ad campaign. That's frankly just like a banner, and you probably have to email everybody and you have to swap that out. So like that's kind of the first iteration that people started to try to do. And there's really very few folks who can do this in a programmatic way like we can. So we've been very fortunate, like the market is growing. People are just becoming aware of this as an ad channel because we really think of email as either one-to-many or one-to-one, and we don't think about the ways that we can attach value to that one-to-one for both the recipient and the sender. It's just a totally unique way of doing things. So if you've seen it, you probably like, you might remember as you see these examples here, you might think like, oh my gosh, I think I've seen that before. But in reality, it's really the most innovative companies who are finding this channel and replacing other channels or augmenting other channels with it. It's quite greenfield right now. And as a marketer, who doesn't want a, a new channel to advertise in that's getting ridiculous return
Yeah.
and where you don't have any competition? I mean, it's kind of the ideal place to be. So
Right.
yeah, absolutely. You're totally right there.
Nice. Yeah, no, I seriously wish I had the budget.
Yeah. So one of the ways we explain is obviously delivering personalized ads to your ideal audience, right? Like these are people you're already in conversation with. And as I mentioned, this is, 10,000 emails per employee per year. So you're talking about a team of 100 is a million emails. That's incredible. So the number of reaches you get there. So let's move on and talk about one of the tips that you dropped in our blog that I'm particularly a fan of is sponsored email newsletters. Now, when we talk about like, hey, this is the new school, you're adding a banner beneath your signature, it's this really cool targeted ad. Email newsletters, this isn't new, but why is it something that we should consider moving into 2022 and thinking about the change? Like, why this channel? Why is this one particularly interesting to you?
So call me new age or just weird. Yeah, if you ask my wife, I am all of the above, especially weird. But particularly around newsletters, right? And, one thing I think for better or worse that social media has done is really increase the amount of tribalism, right? That
Sure.
that people have really sort of flocked to, right? And I'm not going to get into any discussions about Facebook, et cetera. Just more so just the way it's given people the outlet to really seek out others who are very like-minded, right? And
Yeah.
so you see the rise of like companies like Substack, right? Where they've popularized like, oh, hey, like people can make money off of newsletters we run, and at the same time, build their own curated audience, right, or curated community, right? Given that sort of backdrop that we're now in, right, and this has been kind of on the rise for probably the past like 3 years, just looking at it anecdotally,
Sure.
but like knowing, basically, especially knowing who our audience is, right, and knowing the fact that like there are, some really great, not to say newsletter producers, but really great, I don't know, thought leaders is the right term. Don't like to bandy that about, but really some great people who are producing really great content and who have a really captivated audience, right? Like I myself, for example,
Sure.
excuse me, I'm subscribed to quite a few copywriting newsletters where it's like I don't really interact with the content, but I'm happy to like read through the tips and stuff, right? And so
Yeah.
if you apply that sort of lens, not to say like, hey, I'm representative of my audience, like I like what I like certain kinds of ads over
Sure.
others, but more so saying like, hey, given how people really gravitate towards wanting to consume really good info, and they're happy to stay subscribed within a newsletter that reflects their interests, whether it be professional or personal, right? One of the things that I've historically tested in the past and have found great success with in terms of ROI is looking at like, okay, why don't I go to the watering holes that my audience is just congregating around, right?
Yeah.
And so one thing I recommend, and it's not so much like, hey, let me drop $5,000, call it a day, and see what happens, right? But one thing that's really worked for me is as part of the outreach, when you talk to the provider of the newsletter, right? Either the person who curates it or who creates all the content, really get to know them, right? And so it's not so much like, hey, I got a lot of money, do you want to take it? Because they too want to assess you and figure out like, are you going to be a good fit, right, with the kind of content
Yeah.
you're providing to my readers, right? I don't want readers to think like, oh God, he just accepts any sort of sponsors from anybody, right? And
Yeah.
so when you build that relationship, when you figure out like, okay, what's really that good fit? If there's a good mutual fit, great. Then how do we figure out what kind of content should we promote within the newsletter, right? So for example, like I used to work at a log management company, and one of the newsletters that a lot of engineers really appreciated and really enjoyed was called Last Week in AWS. The guy who ran it, Corey Quinn, very nice guy, very very hilarious. He was great to work with in terms of figuring out like, okay, I'm thinking about promoting this ebook, Corey, like what sorts of will this resonate with people, right? And part of the give and take, I encouraged him like, hey, don't feel like you got to pander to me as a marketer, right? Let me know, like,
Yeah.
is this actually going to be insightful? If not, I don't want to run it, right? I don't want to promote something that people are not going to consume, right?
Well,
And so,
so I
yeah,
think that's a pretty specific take on sponsoring email newsletters, because like we might think about it very much as like it's just another place to drop an ad. But what you're describing in terms of sponsoring an email newsletter is like we want to provide some level of content that's going to be engaging, insightful, useful, because it does, obviously the newsletter creator, let's say team of creators, they're incentivized to continue to grow and maintain an audience. They don't actually want to, lose audience because of the poor advertising that they do. So they want to increase that engagement, but then like also, obviously you're looking for people who are going to align, it seems, maybe with your brand values, with the things that you're educating them on. It's not just trying to get them to click through and download some offer or be a part of some piece of content. It's more about, it seems like maybe you're creating this content as a magnet to draw away from that audience, or like, pull from the audience, the people who are most aligned with the things that you're sharing. Does that sound more, versus the traditional, like, hey, let's just plop an ad in here and try to get them to click on it. Does that sound right?
Yeah, you really summed it up nicely, Rex. And by no means am I saying one way is better than the other, right?
Sure.
The traditional way of dropping an ad, I've done that before. I've seen great ROI too, right?
Sure.
It's just one of those things where, to give further context to people, like, part of it, like, so, when I was at a log management company, was marketing to engineers, right? And there's a famous saying from one of the co-founders of Google Docs. She said, engineers dislike marketing and they hate sales, right? So given that aversion to being marketed towards, right? One of the things I had to figure out was like, okay, well, how do I do so in a way that's respectful? That's still, yes, people know it's an ad, it's a sponsored ad in a newsletter. People aren't, stupid, right? But making it clear, like, hey, at least I'm trying to give you some value here, right?
Yeah.
And so that was one way that worked really well, based on what your audience prefers, right? Because, for example, like, I could see, for us marketers, like, let's say, for example, like what you guys have done with, sponsoring an ABM, leadership newsletter. I could see, us marketers like, hey, this looks like a cool offer, right? Like, I personally would just click like that, right?
Yeah.
But, and that's where really no way is correct or the right way in terms of like figuring out how to engage a newsletter sponsor and what newsletters like to sponsor, and at the same time, like, how to get the most return out of it. It all ultimately comes down like, who are you serving, right? And how do they like to be marketed towards?
Yeah, and you're not doing this in a vacuum, right? Like, you should be able to ask the vendor, like, hey, what has been most successful? Like, of the folks who have sponsored this, like, who just had to knock it out of the park? They just keep coming back to you because it keeps winning for them.
Exactly.
And if that example aligns with what you're trying to accomplish, awesome. And if it doesn't, consider other ways to go about it. I think your engineering example, the fact that they dislike marketing and hate sales, totally get that. And I think it's all about your audience. It's all about the channel that you're in. And like, certain newsletters are more in line, like the way that they're formatted, the content that they share is like, hey, here's a roundup of ideas, and one of these is going to be an ad, and everybody's okay with that, versus like, hey, one of my favorite newsletters ever is from my friend James Carberry, who we're going to do a webinar with actually in a couple of months.
Nice.
He sends a very personal sounding email. It's from him. Like, this is his content, his thoughts in paragraph, not bullet points. Like, this is him talking to his audience.
Yeah.
And you can't plop in a bullet pointed ad with a link to your article. Like, you can't do it. It wouldn't fit. So I think you do need to talk to the vendor. You definitely want to talk to them and form that partnership and understand truly what works for them.
Yep.
And then really think about the content, think about the audience, and be specific, as you would with, all the best marketing practices that we already know. But I think for your email newsletters, I think you bring up the great point of like, this is an audience. And if this audience aligns with the audience you want to be talking to, we don't have to go reinvent the wheel. We don't have to run a million ads to go acquire that audience. Like, let's test that audience. Let's go run some campaigns this way. And I think it's a really smart approach. So when we're thinking about building up an audience, let's say we're a little earlier stage, go where the audience is already. I think it's a really good idea, versus having to wait to attack that or approach that audience until you've already built it yourself. You can do both, right? Always be building your audience, of course, but then layer in these strategies as well to take advantage.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Love it. Well, Victor, we've gone through quite a few things here. It's time for a little bit of Q&A. I think we've had some that came in already. So if you've got some questions, please feel free to throw them here into the Q&A. But while we're waiting for those questions to come in, Victor, what questions should people be asking themselves, their teammates, their bosses, as they're thinking about privacy, as they're thinking about the cookieless future? What are things that we should be asking ourselves?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I don't say that because I'm trying to buy some time on my end. No, but really though, I think the first question we should ask ourselves is, what's the best sort of like, who should we start talking to, right, on our end? So for example, like if you're a marketer like me working at a small startup, right, I don't have data teams. I don't have, website developers that I can start, talking to around like, okay, how do we, tailor, our data collection strategies, right? But, if you're, let's say, working at Adobe, for example, this is something where I'd say, really like now really is the time to start those conversations, right? Even something as simple as like, hey guys, I just read this article. You may or may not have heard of it. Could we at least start talking about how we should like tailor the way, we not only collect data, but how do we house that data, right? Do we want to invest in like a customer data platform, right? For example, like Segment, right? And I'm assuming like, a lot of the big enterprises they're already starting to think about that, right? And which is great. But for those of us who are probably working at smaller companies, this is where really just starting to first and foremost, don't panic, right? It's definitely not a, so like, oh my God, we're going to get wiped out. But more so like, hey, just start to think about like, okay, how do we really, batten down the hatches on like what we have within, our CRM, for example, right? How do we make sure, if we're in B2B working with our sales teams, like, hey, guys, let's stop with the spray and pray stuff because, a lot of people are just opting out, right? And really starting that sort of education process, right? And I know us marketers, we're always busy educating internally and externally. But this is another thing where I strongly believe it's like, if we start the conversation now with our teams, with the different stakeholders who, not only like who are kind of public facing in that sense, the better we'll be, come 2022.
Sure. And we got the question, I think it's a little bit tactical here that I love because I always like to get to like where you can actually take action on this advice. At what stage, let's say in company development, it seems, do you need to have a data collection warehousing policy like across like how many team members do you think does it require? How big does a company have to be where you start to have to document that, like actually have a formal policy? Is it very early stage? Should we think about this from we've got 2 marketers and we need to have an official policy? And then kind of ancillary to that or secondary to that, like at what point do you need to publish or start sharing that information? How big of an audience? So how do you think about those, like those figures? How big do we have to be when we start worrying about this?
Yeah. I think personally, I would say like, if you were to roll out something as simple as like a 1.0, like, hey, here's kind of like the like official docs around like, this is how we as a company, how we as a marketing team collect, customer data. I think that's a great first start, right? It doesn't need to be anything overcomplicated, right? And to your example, Rex, like, for a team of 2, like, yep, something as simple as like, hey, this is why we're collecting like first name, last name, work email, company info. And that's pretty much the gist of what we collect, right? Like for B2B, right? That's, I'd say like, that's probably for smaller teams, like really like kind of what all you need for now. But for larger teams, I'd imagine like, where if you have access to data teams, right, customer data platform, right? If you don't, not to say like, oh God, you should have one. If you don't have one, well, what's wrong with you? But more so like, I think starting to refine the language around those and working especially with your compliance teams, right? If you guys have internal compliance teams at your companies, I think that's where if you start those conversations, start figuring out like, okay, what would that sort of ideal, I don't want to say disclaimer, but really that sort of ideal public facing like document, what should that say, right? I think that would probably be the best way to start internally, especially as you guys iron out, because I'd imagine too, not to say like this would need to go through like, 18 rounds of approval, but really it's like, I'd imagine as we get closer to 2022, as we get closer to Google saying like, okay, we're done with cookies. I'd imagine, as it goes up the food chain, people will be increasingly concerned around like, okay, how exactly are we collecting data? How are we informing, people of how we're doing so, right? So really like, if I were to sum up everything, to answer your question more succinctly, Rex, it's never too small or too late to start, at least putting those things down, right? And then really asking others for help and guidance too, because that's really, the best way for us to be able to present that unified front and at the same time, help like really educate our customers around this.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I'll give an example. Like we're about 20 people at OpenSense. We've been around almost 8 years, and in order to get SOC 2 compliance, which we've achieved and taken it to the next level of SOC 2 compliance, we're having to take a really seriously close look at like, okay, CRM hygiene and how is our data stored and all of that stuff. So like we're being forced as a software company, like you're kind of forced into that. If you want to take security seriously, you have to take compliance seriously. You have to take, data collection seriously and start to think more cautiously about that. So it's going to come up, especially if you're a software company, like it's probably already an issue that you should be thinking about, but maybe for those earlier stages, like it's never too soon. It's never too late. I think now, right? When was the best time to plant a tree? Like 20 years ago, the second best time to plant a tree is today, right?
Exactly.
Let's do it now. So awesome. We got another question in the Q&A here. I'm going to hit that. We're going to answer this live here, but how do you see the ads on Facebook, Google Display, et cetera, changing, especially with driving people to subscribe to a newsletter or download content? So like just some examples of how you think those things are going to change.
Yeah, that's a really good question. With for example, well, actually with Google and Facebook, right? For them, they've been referred to as kind of those walled gardens, right? And they more or less are, media publishing behemoths, right? So a lot of what they've developed, I'd imagine, I don't know about Facebook. I can't comment because I haven't seen too much info on them. But knowing how the way Google's shifting towards it, I'd imagine Google's going to come up with their own sort of standard, right, as a cookie alternative, right? People have speculated, and again, this is what you read in the marketing industry, gossip rags. People speculate that Google's going to combine some sort of whatchamacallit, or according to the latest from what I read, and please don't quote me on this, some sort of combination of fingerprinting and profiling, right? But again, this is where for companies like Facebook and Google, where literally their businesses are built on advertising.
Yeah.
I don't think there would be much change for them, right? Because they're going to develop their own they're going to develop their own alternatives, right? And then for us, I think since and I highly doubt they would turn around and say, oh, I'm gonna pull the rug from under you and call it a day and say, sorry, you're not going to see great ROI. I'd imagine they would want to keep our business, right, and keep us engaged with okay, so what are you doing with this, right? Long story short, I feel like they probably will have some good alternatives. I don't know, what would replace retargeting ads. I don't know what Facebook, for example, would do, right? I know I've heard Facebook gets great ROI for marketers across the board, right? But sure, given their wealth of information and really they have so much info on customers everywhere, I feel like they will figure out a way to give us that sort of I don't want to say leverage, but give us an alternative that still works, right? That still allows us to, be respectful of people's privacy, but at the same time, be able to still build out cohorts and segments of people oh, okay, cool. I know, from this campaign, it's this kind of profile, not necessarily oh, hey, I know it's Becky down the street who, bought 2 shoes from me, right? But more so okay, at least, they can tie in all those things, and then we can at least feed it into, if we have a customer data platform or whatever else we use, right? I'd imagine that's, probably what they're already thinking about, if not already testing out.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. I appreciate that. Great answer. Well, look, we're running up on time and we have had a great session. Victor, appreciate you joining us and talking about the future. I mean, it's impossible to predict exactly what would happen. If 2020 has told us anything, it's literally impossible to predict the future. No one could have seen a global pandemic coming. But things are shifting for marketing, and hopefully we've called it out a little bit here, and we start to have more conversations as marketing departments and team leaders and start to think more seriously about what channels we're leveraging, how we're leveraging them, and certainly how we approach customer data, prospect data, et cetera, so that we are giving the best experience to those recipients of our targeting and our advertising. So awesome. Victor, thank you guys for attending. Everybody who came, thank you so much, and everybody's watching the recording. Victor, where can people find out more about you and Tugboat Logic if they've got a minute and they're interested in learning more about compliance and assistance with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm on LinkedIn. I don't bite. You just type in Victor Tugboat Logic and you can find me there. Or if you'd rather, check out our website, it's tugboatlogic.com. I'm not going to spell it out. It's literally tugboat, like the tugboat and then the word logic smashed together.com. Just want to say real quick, thank you everyone for being a part of this conversation with us, right? I will say a big shout out to Rex and then the OpenSense team for, really being one of those first to really start this conversation and do so in a way where it's not trying to fear monger, right? Because there's a lot of articles out there, and it's just like, hey man, when I first read it, this stuff was scary. I don't like, but once you read more, you're like, hey man, it's just the way it's going to be, right? So we have to at least start adapting, right? And we have to at least start the conversation internally, so that way, we don't get caught by surprise.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, we appreciate you calling it out. And it's been great to learn from you and all the deep research that you've been doing. So awesome, Victor. All right, everybody have a great rest of your day, and we appreciate you participating.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Rex.